Hello AP Gov, and here is your Monday Labor Day lesson that kind of goes along with the Federalism worksheet that you were asked to do over the weekend. Today I'm going to show you how I used to tie cakes to the government, and this would have been a food day for us until Parkway decided to not allow us to serve food anymore, so sucks to be us now. But how do cakes and government go hand in hand? That's a great question. Let's go ahead and answer it. So this is a review of the governments that we've been under throughout our history. So we started off under an autocratic system with the monarch of Great Britain, single powerful leader, so one person in charge. And so a pound cake is a single hunk of butter cake, basically. And so the pound cake refers to the autocrat in that they're both single cakes. They're just one large cake or one small cake if you're getting the Sara Lee pound cakes that I used to serve in class. So that's just the connection there. Then we broke away and won our independence, and so we created a confederation where we have separate independent parts, kind of like Twinkies. Twinkies are individually wrapped in a box. They are separate and independent from one another. So if you think of each Twinkie as a colony, that's pretty much the cake theory there. But then the Articles of Confederation were pretty weak, and we decided to create a stronger federal government, and that gives us federalism. And federalism is having a stronger combination of national and state governments. And under federalism, there are two cake theories because there are really two kinds of federalism that we've had in our history. Split layer cake is going to be connected with something called dual federalism. And then the marble cake theory is going to be connected to something called the cooperative federalism. And we're going to go over both of those styles and see which one we are in today. But these are the three cake theories of government: pound cake, Twinkie, and the split layer and marble cake. And so we would have had, we would have had a sample of any of these that you could have had. So go on out and take a picture of you eating one of these kind of four cakes and send it to me, and I'll post it. Let's just go to this one. So in federalism is defined very easily as a division of power between state and federal governments, or federal and regional governments. So in the United States, we actually have state, local, and federal. And so when you think of federalism, just think of this simple definition that we have different levels of government, like a wedding cake. And constantly you are asking the question, who's the boss? Who's in charge of doing things? And you're going to have a chart where we're going to debate these topics that you were supposed to fill out over the weekend as well. So with dual federalism, otherwise known as the split layer cake, there are rigid walls of separation between what the states do and what the government or the federal government does. So the states do A, B, and C, the national government does X, Y, and Z, and there is very little overlap. And it's represented in the split layer cake because if you've ever seen a split layer cake, you know that there are different levels of the cake and they are very distinct. They don't merge with each other. They are very specific layers. And that's to simulate that states have very specific powers and national government has very specific powers. This is what we had up until the Great Depression. And then once the Great Depression hit, the federal government started doing things that normally the states were doing. And so we switched to something called an cooperative federalism. In cooperative federalism, you start having both the national and state government doing things. The national and state governments act jointly. And so here the lines of power are blurred. And so this is represented by a marble cake, because if you've ever seen a marble cake, you know that there are swirls of chocolate and vanilla, and it's very hard to determine where one layer is and where another one is, just like it's hard to determine whose job is it, or sometimes it's both of their jobs. And so that's what we're in right now. Although Donald Trump is definitely moving more back toward letting states do things and getting the federal government out of things. And so you could argue that we might be moving back toward a dual federalism, although we haven't quite made it back yet. So those are the two types of federalism, dual and cooperative. Again, dual, very specific federal jobs, very specific state jobs, whereas in cooperative federalism, they're both doing the similar things. Well, because we have federal powers and state powers and both powers, there are really three types of powers. There are enumerated powers, or they're also known as delegated powers. And these are powers that are listed in the Constitution only for the federal government. So enumerated is federal, EF. And so that's how I always remember it. And these are powers that are listed in the Constitution. So the federal government can do all of these things: coin money, regulate commerce, declare war, establish post offices, and they have a whole bunch of others. Then they passed in the Bill of Rights the 10th Amendment. And the 10th Amendment basically says that if a power is not listed in the Constitution, then it is automatically reserved for the states. And so that is the definition of reserved power. It's powers that are given to the states because that power is not listed in the Constitution for the federal government. So states get to conduct elections. And so every state can do things a little bit differently. So some states do mail-in ballots, whereas Missouri does not. Some states do all electronic voting machines. Some do all paper. All of those things can be determined by the states. Also, school systems are done by the states. Ratification of amendments are done by states. So these are all powers that are state powers because of the 10th Amendment. So not only do you need to know what the definition of reserve powers is, you have to know the 10th Amendment. So we have now gone over voting amendments, 15, 19, 23, 24, 26, and now we're getting into another amendment, the 10th Amendment. Then there are powers that are shared by both governments, that both governments, state and federal, can do. Levy taxes, borrow money, make banks, make roads. And so because we have federalism, we have federal-only powers, we have state-only powers, and we have shared powers. And so if you think of it like a Venn diagram, there is your federal, state, and then the both is where they merge. We have one federal, we have 50 state, and then we have a little over 87,000 local. So here in the St. Louis area, the St. Louis County is one of 3,043, and then the city of St. Louis, which is separate, is one of 19,431. But we also have Manchester, Baldwin, Chesterfield, and those are also within this little one as well. We are also, Parkway is one of 13,500 school districts, and we also have a special school district as well. We're going to get into these a little bit later on, so we're going to skip over this for right now, but implied powers deal with Congress. We're going to talk about that a little bit later on when we talk about some Supreme Court cases, so we'll introduce that a little bit later. And then the inherent powers are those with the president. So here's a practice question if you want to stop and take a look at it. Here's a practice question if you want to stop and take a look at it. Here's a practice question if you want to stop and take a look at it. Here's a practice question if you want to stop and take a look at it. Here is a practice question. Okay, so now we've got to talk about funding real quickly. The federal government obviously makes a lot of money through income taxes and other kinds of taxes, and a lot of times they will share that money with states in what we call grant programs. And so we're going to go over three types of grants. And these are all examples of how the federal government gives state governments money, but some are more liberal in how they do it, and some are more conservative in how they do it. And so we're going to go over each of those. And so you're going to need to know the specifics of these three. So the first one is a categorical grant. A categorical grant is a very specific targeted purpose. Let's say a bridge. So a state wants to build a bridge, and so they would apply for a categorical grant to build that bridge. But with categorical grants, there are very strict restrictions and oftentimes strings attached, and I'll explain what that means in just a second. One of those strings is that the state might have to match what the federal government gives it. So for instance, if we want to build a bridge in Missouri and the federal government gives us $500,000, then Missouri would have to match that with $500,000. And if you don't match, then you don't get the money. About 90% of federal dollars come through these kind of grants. Okay? And here's an example. So we talked about state X wants a bridge. However, these are the strings that are attached, but you have to do an environmental study first, and the state has to pay for that. So how is the bridge going to affect the environment? And they might say, oh, by the way, you also have to lower your legal alcohol drinking limit to 0.08. Oh, and by the way, to build the bridge, you have to hire welfare people. These are all legal limits that the federal government can place on states if they want a categorical grant. So these three things right here would all be examples of these restrictions and strings attached. So when you are explaining a categorical grant, it's a very specific thing, and there are very specific restrictions and strings attached. And so here's that diagram once more. Formula grants are grants where states apply and the federal government will share the cost with a predetermined formula. And so that's why we call it a formula grant. So it might be an 80-20 formula. The federal government will spend 80% and the states have to pay 20. That's what it is, I believe, for roads right now. And the money will only be provided from the federal government if the state is able to meet its requirement. Otherwise, it won't do it. This is normally how we do pay for highways, airports, bridges. And I got to go back here for a second. With categorical grants, states all get the same amount of money. So it doesn't matter what you apply for, you get the same amount of money. Whereas in a formula grant, on a formula grant, it's based on need. So if you have a greater need, you get more money. If you have less of a need, then you get less money. So this one is based on need. And then the third kind of grant is a block grant. Block grants, now the first two are liberal because they both empower the federal government. The federal government comes up with the specific purpose and also comes up with the strings attached and the restrictions. So the categorical grant really puts the federal government in power. Same thing with formula grants, because the federal government is writing the formula, and so they can change the formula whenever they need to. And so they have the power. The conservatives didn't really like those grants, so they came up with the idea of the block grant. And so here, the federal government gives money to states, but there are no strings attached. And instead of it being a very specific purpose, what the federal government does is it just picks a broad category or a broad block, like education or crime. And then the states get to use that money for anything within that category. So, for instance, let's say that there is a block grant for education, and Missouri applies and wants to spend it on buses. They could do that. But let's say Illinois wants to buy textbooks. They could do that. And let's say Iowa wants to hire new teachers. They could all do that because they're all spending money within the broad block of education. But this gives states the flexibility to use it in different ways. And so that's why the conservatives liked it, because it actually empowered the states. And so this is an example of devolution, where the federal government is becoming less powerful, and that's a vocabulary word that you need to know. So if you think of a block grant like a gift card, if you get a gift card to, say, Deerberg's, you can go buy a steak or you can go buy Gatorade, kind of like a block grant, whereas a categorical grant is more like a coupon. You can only use that for a very specific item, and that's because categorical grants are very specific. Okay, so that's the difference. You're going to need to know the difference between categorical grants, formula grants, and block grants. And obviously categorical grants and block grants are very different, because no strings attached for a very broad topic, whereas categorical grants are very specific with strings and restrictions attached. And we just talked about devolution is passing down authority from the national government to the state governments. Obviously, this is a very conservative idea, and so conservatives want to devolution things. And Donald Trump is doing this with COVID. He is basically letting the states take charge. There's another term that you're going to need to jot down called an unfunded mandate. Unfunded mandates are when the federal government passes a law that mandates that something happens but provides no money for it. And so they're basically telling the states, you have to do this, and we're not giving you any money to do it. So obviously states hate unfunded mandates, and conservatives hate unfunded mandates because they feel like it's the federal government taking control. And so an unfunded mandate are, again, regulations or conditions, and you don't get any money. So for receiving grants, you're not getting any grants. You're just being told to do something, but you're not being reimbursed. So think of, for instance, I'm going to give you two famous examples. The Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, basically said, states, all buildings have to be handicap accessible, and you're going to have to make them handicap accessible, but we're not going to give you any money for it. And so buildings had to all of a sudden start doing curb cuts. They started to have to do mechanical doors that could open. Bathrooms had to be widened and given a stall. And if you had a multi-level building, it had to have an elevator that was handicap accessible. And so the ADA said, states, you have to do that, and you guys are going to pay for it. So Parkway had to pay for all of its schools to be handicap accessible. But it did give them a 10-year window to do it. And so everybody pretty much got it done within those 10 years. No Child Left Behind is an education act that basically said, states, you're going to have to test your kids in reading and math, and you're going to have to pay for the test and the grading of the test and the telling everybody what the results are, and we're not going to give you any money for that. And so those are two very famous examples of unfunded mandates. There are a couple of other ones. There's the Real ID Act, which the federal government now places things that if you're going to have driver's license that's going to be accepted by the federal government, it has to have certain things on it. And Missouri does not. So a regular Missouri ID does not. So you have to get a real ID. The Clean Water and Clean Air Act basically had the federal government telling states you have to clean your air and you have to clean your water, and we're not paying for it. Endangered Species Act basically says you have to protect these animals and we're not paying for it. The Brady Bill basically outlawed some guns and restricted guns. And then the Welfare Reform Act basically said, states, you're going to have to change how you do your welfare system, and we're not going to pay for it. So these are some other unfunded mandates. So this is a little old. This is 2016, but you can see that the states who received the most amount of money, Mississippi was number 1, Louisiana was number 2, New Mexico was number 3, Arizona was number 4, Kentucky was number 5, we were number 10, Illinois was number 40. Now, I've got to find an updated chart to do this, but this just gives you an idea of, and it's ironic that it's a conservative state, conservative state, conservative state, and we have a lot of those high number ones receiving federal funding. They just happen to be conservative states with Republican governors, so they the Democrats would say, oh, you guys like to have all the power, but then you're more than welcome to take out the federal money. And so they would say that that's a little bit hypocritical. And I do know that, for instance, New York, they were complaining that, they don't take as much money from the federal government. They pay a lot more to the federal government than they get back, and they wanted some of that for the COVID fight. And some of those other states that had the same thing were complaining as well. Here's a practice question for you. Practice question for you. And then here are some vocabulary terms. So that's a little bit of a rundown of federalism and knowing what it is, and then the funding procedures you have to know as well. Hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you later.